be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see. So I will fight if you'll fight. Yeah, I will fight, but only if you'll fight. Oh, we can make it through this like sailors in a tempest. Like sailors in a tempest together. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our special edition of the Lung Cancer Living Room. As many of you know, we are providing to you a weekly living room in an effort to rapidly respond to some of the changes and adaptations that are being made in our community. And today we're going to be talking about how science and research specifically are changing and adapting. I'm Danielle Hicks, Chief Patient Officer here at GoTo Foundation, and we are thrilled to have all of you. Thank you for joining. With us today to discuss this topic are my colleagues, Jennifer King, PhD, Chief Scientific Officer at GoTo, Amy Moore, also PhD, Director of Science and Research here at GoTo, and Andrew Ciupek, PhD, Manager of Clinical Research here at GoTo. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I talked a little bit about this temporary switch to the rapid response. There have been a few little glitches over the last few weeks, but we've got it, I think, buttoned down and pulled together today. So please, wherever you are signing in from, whether it be Facebook Live or the YouTube live video, if you have questions, as always, we encourage those questions throughout. So please get them into the chat, and our moderators will make sure to get them over to us so that we can get them answered for you. Tonight's topic, I understand, based on some of the things that we've heard from our lung cancer community, are a little bit sensitive, right? Because there are some concerns around clinicians and researchers potentially, if not already, having to redirect some of their efforts during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we recognize that it's a sensitive topic. We want you guys to know that we're here for you to help in any way that we can. So we are very, very mindful of that. With that, I'm going to jump into to the conversation. So I'm going to start off with Amy Moore and ask her if she can tell us a little bit about what you're seeing from a science and research standpoint during these unprecedented times.
Sure. And I think you're right in mentioning that this is a challenging time for our community. It's a challenging time for biomedical research in general. We're obviously engaged in listening to what's going on out there and hearing from across the country. And I think it's important to level set so that people have an understanding for what the reality is, and then also how we're responding to deal with that adjusted reality. And, the sheer matter of the fact is that COVID is forcing many labs across the country to shutter. And when I say that, I mean, because we're sheltering in place, that obviously has an impact on people's ability to go to the lab and to do research. That being said, there is a great mobilization of the biomedical research enterprise against COVID. So what does that look like in real terms for people who are doing research? For MDs, it may mean that they're now being deployed to the front line to help respond to the crisis at hand and to deal with influx of patients to their hospitals and medical centers and so forth. For PhDs and lab personnel, it means that they can focus on the types of tasks they can do from home, such as writing grant applications, writing manuscripts, finishing up or continuing some of that important work. The writing of science isn't as important as the doing of the science. And often, we're so busy doing that the writing kind of often sometimes falls to the back burner. So that's a good thing. There are things that we can do from home to keep the research enterprise moving forward. In terms of, impacts on the actual work, the reality is a lot of institutions and funding agencies have put in place mechanisms to support these efforts. For example, we as GO2 have worked closely with a lot of the patient groups to develop preclinical models, to develop cell lines, or to develop animal models. And those things don't take care of themselves. They have to be tended. And somebody has to go in and take care of those resources because it's a significant investment of time, money, and resources to develop them. So institutions are allowing that work to continue, although scaled back. So what do you have to do just to kind of maintain those while you may not be actively doing lots of experiments with them? So that's encouraging. And we have been funders of young investigators, and what we're observing is that funding agencies across the spectrum are coming together and figuring out how to respond and putting in place contingencies for investigators, giving them flexibility in terms of how their grant monies are spent. A great deal of grant funding goes to support salaries of investigators and lab personnel. So there's flexibility there. There are things called no-cost extensions where funders can, extend the terms of an original funding period to allow work to continue beyond the end that was originally determined. So those mechanisms can give us some flexibility in times like this. I think I was just on a call this week with my colleagues across the other lung cancer advocacy organizations, and something that's very top of mind for us is the potential impact on junior investigators. So not just junior faculty who are just starting their research labs, but the graduate students, the postdocs, those who are ready to kind of transition into academic appointments, if you will. And those concerns are real, and a lot of institutions are looking at considerations of, do we add to the tenure clock? For example, do we extend the number of years that investigators have to achieve tenure? I think as scary as all of that sounds, and it does sound scary when we're, obviously talking about cancer and how do we accelerate discovery of new therapeutics and, new trials and things that can extend and save and improve lives, to think about that being somehow on hold is scary. But the reality is the whole community is invested in figuring out a path forward, and how do we continue to take care of our most critically, our most urgent patients. And we'll get into, I think, a discussion of how we can kind of adapt for various needs depending on where patients are in their treatment journey. But the reality is there's such significant mobilization of the research community against COVID, against the issue at hand. That's very encouraging, and the pace we're moving is very encouraging. So I do want us not to lose hope, in the face of this, because many, many people are working on this and trying to figure out how we can adapt in these challenging times, and that includes, how do we incorporate telehealth? How do we adapt clinical trials to be more flexible and to ensure that our patients are taken care of? So I'll pause there because I know Jennifer and Andrew are going to address some of those points in particular. But yeah, the reality is there are impacts, but the encouraging news is we're all working together to figure out how to move forward.
I think that's a really great point, Amy. And I think that when we look at the actual amount of time that this has been going on here in the United States, right, and with the shutdowns and sort of these reallocations of duties and all of these things, we're talking about a 4 to 6 week maybe time frame. So the encouraging thing for me is that they are thoughtfully thinking about this moving forward and how some of these adaptations will ultimately come back and benefit the patient still at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, none of it's being taken lightly.
Yes,
I mean, that's the point.
Yeah. Jennifer, so can we talk a little bit about how science and research is adapting in this new reality? Amy kind of touched on some high points, but can you go into a little bit of detail for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Amy gave a great high-level summary because, like she said, the whole community really still wants to move science and research forward. So what we're seeing is a lot of adaptations that will really allow some trials to continue, different research studies to try to move on in slightly different ways. But in the end, increased flexibility than we used to see in a lot of research studies. So the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, actually put out guidance for clinical trials. And that is allowing those who sponsor clinical trials to make easier, quicker changes to the trial to allow many things that are really in the interest of patient safety. And the FDA guidance was very clear that patient safety is the number one most important thing in all of this. And so those types of adaptations are allowing patients to go on and to stay on trials in different ways than they may have before. Last week's Lung Cancer Living Room was all about telehealth and telemedicine and how you can get appointments online and policy issues around that. That's something that's now being incorporated into clinical trials in a way that really hadn't been very well before. So there's much more flexibility about telemedicine, telehealth type visits when you're on a trial. Also from a science and research standpoint, access to drugs without endangering patients by having them contract coronavirus is really important. So these trials are also coming in with additional flexibility on things like, could you get your infusions at home? Can you get the drug that you would be taking on trial sent to you if it's an oral therapeutic as opposed to having to come in? So we're starting to see changes in clinical trials that really are a benefit overall to the scientific community, even though it's sad that it took this sort of horrible pandemic situation to drive them forward. Another great example is mobile phlebotomy. Patients who need blood draws are often able now to get blood draws near where they live or even sometimes at home. And so these are all things that trials are starting to take advantage of. As we go to reconsider our science and research portfolio and what studies that we and our partner organizations are really performing in-house, these things are playing a major role. So we have examples of research studies that have had to come not to a halt, but to a slower place because of enrollment issues. For example, we do a number of things in the early detection space, and right now it's not being recommended that you come in for lung cancer screening. So some of our trials that take place at the time of lung cancer screening are not actively enrolling new patients. However, they continue to do all the follow-up with all the patients who were enrolled before, as well as, to Amy's point, things like writing papers, putting out the science, making sure that what's already been found is out there. So, but that's a study that has had a kind of impact in that space. On the flip side, we have studies that do remote consent. So a study like historically the genomics of young lung cancer, but right now we have a study called Spacewalk through our sister organization Alchemy, and Spacewalk is looking at resistance of ALK-positive lung cancer. For the Spacewalk study, anyone can enroll from anywhere around the country, no matter what oncologist you're seeing, and at that point, a mobile phlebotomist can come take a blood draw from the patient and send that to a lab. So that type of study actually really hasn't been impacted, and we're still able to enroll patients on that type of research study. So there is some positive news that there are studies moving forward. People are getting treatments in innovative ways, and we're really seeing these innovative studies like Spacewalk move forward at a good pace. There's also an opportunity, and I'll speak to it a little more, I think, later too, but to do research from the comfort of your own home, right? One of the things we've been internally prioritizing is some of our studies within the lung cancer registry. The lung cancer registry really involves patient and caregiver reported information. If you haven't joined the registry, you can join at www.lungcancerregistry.org. But we have a number of new surveys that we are launching in the registry this year looking at lung cancer survivorship, and those types of studies can still continue. In addition, we're going to use the registry as an opportunity to learn more about COVID-19 and how it's affecting our patients. There's already a poll question up asking about how your cancer treatment may have been affected so far by the pandemic. So there's still a lot of places that research is happening, and a lot of ways that go to our partners and many other organizations are able to keep moving science forward, even during this difficult time.
That's really great information, Jennifer. I want to touch on a little bit more on the registry and why it's important, and specifically, as you know, all of this really does point out back to this virus, this novel virus that no human on the planet has an immunity to. We don't know anything about it. Why it's important for us to be able to collect this data. You mentioned the poll. Can you talk a little bit about the type of information we're collecting in the poll on the registry and why that's important for us to start kind of picking away at how COVID is impacting lung cancer patients?
Yes, so right now the poll that's up is specific to how your treatment has been impacted. This is one of many, many questions that we're going to want to look at moving forward. So what we're seeing is that people in states that have been known to be hotspots are actually reporting more treatment delays than those in other states, which is not surprising. Seeing highest issues in California and New Jersey and places that they've seen a lot of COVID-19 cases. But what we're seeing is some people are having delays in doctor's appointments, delays in screening and imaging, and these delays may later translate to differences in the care that was received and the effects on treatment. So the nice thing about the registry is we also collect treatment information, we collect quality of life, we collect a lot of information on how things are impacting the patients, and we're going to be able to go back and really assess some of these treatment differences, resurvey people, and talk to people about, well, if you had this type of delay, we can learn more and see how that may or may not have impacted longer term outcomes. So we're really excited about that piece. There's whole other initiatives, which I can talk to now or talk to later. I want to make sure Andrew gets a chance too, about studying those who have been infected with coronavirus and exhibiting COVID-19, as well as diagnosed with lung cancer. And I think that's another really important area that we should come back to later.
Yeah, that's great, Jennifer. Thank you. I thank you for elaborating on that, because I think a lot of people don't really understand the registry as it sits, or why these patient-reported outcomes are so important for us to be able to gather, to then pair with actual clinical outcomes and really be able to get a big picture view of what's going on. So thank you for elaborating on that. Andrew, I want to jump to you, and then we can come back to some of these other things that Amy and Jennifer have talked about. And talk a little bit about how GoTo is moving forward and what we are seeing during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Bill, some of the trends we've noticed that Jennifer and Amy were mentioning about research adapting in clinical trials, adapting to the new kind of situation and trying to help patients in the best way possible. We become aware of that, and we really wanted to make sure that we could be a resource to the patient community, and we did that through our Lung Match program. And I think just for everyone, Lung Match is our kind of clinical trials treatment and molecular testing navigation program, in which we have patients can call our helpline, or they can email our support at gotofoundation.org email address. And really, we help people get access to molecular testing, answer their questions about clinical trials, and answer their treatment questions. And I think, there's a lot to sort through at the best of times. And now with all the changes and adaptations we're seeing because of the COVID situation, we're trying to stay ahead of that as an organization and as a program, and kind of keep our ear to the ground and hear kind of like the practical things that are happening to patients and pass that information on so that patients know what to ask their doctors, and they can be aware of some of those changes. So the Lung Match program and the navigators that are part of it, myself and others, we really tried to talk to people, some of the sponsors and the companies who are running clinical trials, some of our clinical partners, and actually, most importantly, a lot of the patients that call us that are actually joining clinical trials right now, or are already on a clinical trial and are trying to, keep navigating that and finding it out or passing information on to us. And so we really want to be able to keep track of that and pass that on. And that's why, now as a program, when patients call us, we're trying to keep a track of that and pass it on. And I think, one of the most important sources of information we've gotten during this time is just from patients sharing their stories. And we've kind of come up with some of the trends, of what's actually happening with clinical trials out there. And Jennifer and Amy mentioned some of the adaptations clinical trials are making, both one in helping people join clinical trials during this time, but two, and also making sure that patients are safe and can, attend a clinical trial with the least amount of risk related to the virus or other things. And, I just thought being able to share that some of the stories that our team has heard over the past month would be really helpful to people to hear. One of the first trends we're hearing is relating to how people are joining clinical trials during this time. And I think, what's really hopeful is that we're hearing that, in some cases, patients are still able to enroll on clinical trials relatively normally. And, during this time with kind of minimal impact how they would normally do that. We talked to a patient just last week who was screened for a clinical trial on Thursday and is going to go for actually their first protocol treatment on the trial tomorrow on Wednesday. And really, they're the only changes they've had to make is the clinic is taking increased precaution to make sure that they reduce their risk from exposure to the virus. And unfortunately, the family and loved ones that normally attend appointments with them won't be able to attend to kind of reduce that risk, but they're still able to join. It's a once weekly infusion, and they're still able to do that. What we're hearing, though, is that can be location and actually sometimes clinic dependent. So where you are may affect, as Jennifer was talking about earlier, different areas of the country are being impacted at different levels by the virus at this moment in time, and that may be reflected. We also talked to another patient earlier this month who tried to join one of the larger, earlier stage clinical trials, the Alchemist trial, which is looking at targeted therapy to use for stage 1 to 3 non-small cell lung cancer patients after surgery. And their center actually was not currently enrolling patients onto that trial. They told them that they would kind of be calling them at 1 month intervals to see if that had changed and if they could enroll. But it just goes to show that while some people are able to join, some clinics are not actively able to enroll. So having to keep in mind that, some of this is location dependent. And that's one of the things we're trying to keep abreast of as a Lung Match team is when patients call us, what have we heard about locations that are enrolling normally and one aren't, and pass that on. But the other thing we're also hearing is that from the patients, that there's a lot of changes in the adaptations clinical trials are making for patients that are already a part of a clinical trial to kind of reduce their risk of exposure to the virus and make sure that, they have the safest experience possible. And some of the things that Jennifer and Amy were talking about in terms of telemedicine, mobile phlebotomy and things, we're actually hearing that that's already, being implemented for individual patients on individual trials. And it can vary to the degree of which it's being done. For instance, we talked to a patient earlier in the month who was able to get a lot of these adaptations made to reduce the amount of times they had to go to the clinic for the clinical trial they were already enrolled on. But it required a lot of kind of upfront effort on their part, a lot of kind of stress and calling a lot of individual partners, the clinical trial doctor, local resources. But what they were actually able to set up is the clinical trial is now sending them the trial drug. It's a targeted therapy directly to their home and making sure they receive the doses, following up with them. They were actually able to arrange for a mobile phlebotomist to come to their home to actually draw the blood so they don't have to leave home as part of the clinical trial. And they were able to set up telemedicine visits with the trial doctor. So for regular check-ins, they can just do that instead of going to the clinic. They told us they still have to go in for certain CT scans that are required as part of the clinical trial, but that they've managed to implement that so that they get everything that they need to be done at one appointment. They don't have to go in as often to their cancer center. Now, sometimes that varies. We've also heard there's some clinical trials that are actually kind of reaching out and setting up a lot of these things for the patients. We talked to a patient who's on a different clinical trial, and the trial actually reached out with a plan in place to switch over. They set up telemedicine visits for them. They had to have the drug mailed to them, which they helped set up. And also they switched over a lot of the resources, such things as the scans and the blood draws they needed, to be more local to them so they wouldn't have to go to the cancer center they normally go to, where there are a lot of patients. They might be at risk for being exposed to the virus, but they set up the blood draws that were required for the trial to be done at a local kind of LabCorp facility like a Quest Diagnostics, which had a lot less people. And also they were able to set up the CT scans, which would normally be done at the cancer center, through a local outpatient imaging center, which had a lot less people at it. So most of the things they were able to stay at home for, and other things they could go locally. And we're seeing, one of the things that's really been impressive to me is that these adaptations are happening relatively quickly, and they're being made to help these patients. So we're trying to keep track of that and just pass that on. And there's, a lot of good news to share.
That's great, Andrew. I wonder, I have a question for you. I know we're looking to see if there's any questions coming in from online, but while we wait, and this question is sort of to all of you, so anybody feel free to chime in. Some of these adaptations that are being made and some of these innovative ways in which people are still, being able to participate in the trials that they were already in, who, I guess, and maybe you guys aren't the right people to ask, I'm not sure, I'm sure you are, who determines whether or not that's a step that can be taken? Is that something that the hospitals already had sort of set up in place? Or I guess I'm just trying to think, is there an opportunity here we touched a little bit last week during our telehealth conversation about not only patients benefiting from being able to have these appointments virtually with their physicians, but from physician to physician, being able to learn from one another that way. I'm wondering if there's not an opportunity there so that more of these stories can be happening around the country, if that made any sense.
I'll respond first. I mean, I think, what we're seeing in the wake of this crisis is no shortage of experts coming together, webinars, phone calls, kind of sharing what they're learning and observing so that they can share those best practices with one another. And, to echo what Jennifer and Andrew have both said, this varies greatly according to where you are in the country and the degree of COVID, the presence of COVID in that community. So while I think it's heartening to see, efforts being put into place to formalize some policies and to put in contingencies and flexibilities, I think at the end of the day, what we would still advise all patients is, much of this is still being done case by case. So it, underscores the importance of the patient talking to their doctor and their treatment team to come up with the best plan for their individual care. But again, there are so many efforts. I was on a call this morning, with investigators across institutions in the U.S., where we're sorting through, with impacts on clinical trials. What does it mean for surgery? What does it mean for radiation? And so on and so forth. And so we're learning as we go, and we're sharing our findings with each other as we go to help each other.
And
Thanks,
I'll
Amy. That's
totally
great.
second that. I think, as Amy said, it's a time of innovation. The one thing I probably didn't mention in the FDA clinical trials piece is that these innovations do still have to go through an IRB, which is an ethics committee, usually at the local institution, but it can be central to multiple institutions. So there is still some level of review. And again, it's all around patient safety. But there's room for a lot of innovation, and I completely second what Amy said. We are seeing people come together quickly, fast, and really acting as a team against this disease across institution, multi-country, international efforts, all sorts of things to learn best practices and implement them as quickly as possible. And the patient-doctor conversations couldn't be more important at this time.
Yeah, and I think that's, Jennifer, what you were saying is really backed up by just what we're hearing, talking to patients through Lung Match and other things. We're hearing some of the stories I shared about people are making these adaptations, and that it's happening relatively quickly. I mean, a lot of the stories I shared have happened in the past month, and how quickly, people are coming together to, change and make sure that patients get access to research and clinical trials. It's just been really amazing for me to hear, and that it's really happening.
That's great. Thank you for the input there, because I can imagine there will be some patients who watch this who maybe it's not happening that way where they are, and they'll want to know why. So being able to explain that these changes are happening, people are talking, but it's not just to flip the switch and make these changes, right? It's all about how can we do this, number one, in a safe environment for patients, right? Okay, I want to shift a little bit. Amy, I want to go back to you and talk about how major research funders are adapting to this new climate, specifically the NIH, CDMRP. Could you explain what NIH and the CDMRP, LCRP are, and then a little bit about how they're adapting?
Sure, and I alluded a little bit to this in kind of my introductory comment. So the NIH refers to National Institutes of Health, and that's the largest federal funder of biomedical research here in the U.S. And the CDMRP, through the Department of Defense, the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, which, we had already been calling on them to increase research funding to support lung cancer research. And, so again, what we're seeing is, not only across federal funding agencies, but across foundations that fund research, basically all funding entities are coming up with contingencies to allow flexibility during this time. And, like I mentioned, there's the, piece that allows for greater flexibility in how those grant funds are deployed against salary. So, even though people might be forced to be at home and can't do some of the, experiments they were funded to do, there's flexibility in getting those people paid. There's flexibility in, how reporting requirements. So, for all funding, we want to make sure that we capture accurately how that money is used. And there's a lot of reporting that goes into that, but we're being a little more lenient in how we collect that data and the timing of that information. So there's flexibility there. There's flexibility on what I call these no-cost extensions, where we allow work to continue beyond the original kind of termination date of the award. So that gives flexibility there for, once we come out of this period of social distancing and kind of quarantine, to allow for resumption of activities and for that work to continue. So I think there's great accommodation and recognition that we need to be flexible, that, the potential impacts on biomedical research are real, and we need to take it seriously. But at the same time, as we're, trying to get through this, kind of acute crisis, if you will, we're looking ahead to how do we position ourselves to effectively kind of ramp back up once it's safe to do so. And so it's encouraging that all these funding organizations are kind of coming together to address, come up with some kind of standard practices and guidelines, if you will, to help our investigators, because we need all hands on deck, right? And so that's what it's kind of looking like right now.
Great. Thanks, Amy. I want to shift a little bit, Jennifer, and come back to you. We touched on it, or you touched on it a little bit earlier, but I want to talk about some of the efforts to really understand COVID-19 infections in people who have or are at high risk for lung cancer. What are some of the things happening around that? Oop. Can't hear you. You might be on mute.
Oh.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
So
it's a great question. And what we're really looking to is the future of where research is going in the context of lung cancer and COVID. So it's still early, right? People are just being diagnosed with cases, but already we've seen these great mobilizations of the research community to start to understand the really important critical questions for our community. And that's so great to see and so important for the future. So we're seeing efforts to track cases of COVID-19 in patients with cancer. One is called CCC19, which is a cross-cancer registry of patients with all different types of cancer globally who are also diagnosed with COVID-19. But one more specific to our community is called TerraVault, which is just patients who have been diagnosed with lung cancer and also now have a COVID-19 infection. And these types of new consortia and researcher collaborations are going to be really important as we move forward and try to learn how to manage the disease both at the time of infection as well as long term. So we've been talking with the TerraVault investigators, and what they're doing right now is it is all surveys of the medical professionals who've been treating these patients to understand the clinical course of their COVID-19 infection, as well as how that was managed and how their lung cancer was managed during that time. And we're very quickly learning from these patients. So those investigators actually already have over 200 patients and have written up their first manuscript on what it looks like to have COVID-19 infection and lung cancer. That's an effort that's across 19 different centers in 9 countries. So it's a pretty amazing
I don't know if Jennifer froze for everybody or if she just froze for me.
We are talking with them about how to now incorporate a patient-reported survey, which is not live yet. So far, it's just live for medical professionals. But moving forward, we're going to have the ability to be able to track what patients are saying and what you're thinking and how people are managing the COVID infections in the lung cancer community from the patient perspective moving forward. So we're really excited about that. That will launch in hopefully few weeks to a month on a TerraVault website, and it's an effort that we're really looking forward to. As what you and I, Danielle, spoke about earlier, we really want to follow patients over time to understand their patient-reported outcomes as well as the clinical outcomes that are being reported by the medical community. And both sets of outcomes are really important for the full picture of what survivorship of lung cancer by itself, but also of lung cancer after COVID-19 infection will look like. It's an interesting time because there are so many questions. I think we don't fully understand the impact of the infection itself. We don't yet understand the biology of how the COVID-19 infection will impact lung cancer. We don't understand what the treatment delays may result in. There's many, many, many research questions, and it just goes to show that the future mobilization of research, when we can all get closer back to normal, as Amy talked about, is so important. And investment in research at this time continues to be a really important area because there will be so many questions as we're coming out of the stay-at-home orders that we're in now.
I think it's that's a perfect sort of segue into a next question that just came from online, and we're talking about sort of what science is doing, where we need to go. And this question is coming in from a very real place in our community, and that's a fearful place, right, around actually getting the virus. So the question that came through online are what recommendations, and Amy, I'm going to let you speak to this because I know you just did a very lengthy report on it. What are we recommending for our patient community and really all high risk? We're all at risk for getting the disease, right? Mm-hmm. The high risk comes into some of the comorbidities and other things you may have going on that put you at this higher level. So the question is, what are the recommendations that people who are most at risk, insofar as continuing social distancing, do they need to wait until there's a vaccine to go back to life as they knew it?
Right. This is certainly a delicate question. I think the reality is, we talk about flattening the curve, and, social distancing is allowing us to do that. And we've seen on the West Coast in particular that has been successful. And, part of that is to not overburden the healthcare system. But we do know from studies that have already come out of China that cancer patients are indeed at increased risk. And it appears that lung cancer patients or those with underlying conditions that compromise their lung function appear to be at elevated risk. We're still working to understand what exactly that means and what are the long-term implications for these patients. But it would suggest that, yes, those individuals need to continue to take precautions until we have an effective therapeutic or vaccine. Now, the reality is, you say, oh my God, but we've heard that maybe 18 months, it may be longer. Do you truly expect me to social distance for the next 2 years? And that is not an easy answer, but that's the reality of what we may be facing. And so we talk about, and there's some articles that describe what we're doing now as the hammer, and then, this kind of protracted period of the dance where we start to loosen restrictions and we start to kind of, restart our society, and we may see flare-ups. And when that happens, we may have to put the hammer down again, close down again until we can so that we can maintain and contain the virus. So I think that's the reality of what we're going to be facing. And it may look different depending on where you are in the country, right? Right now, we've seen the highest burden on our coast. And, places more internal to the country have not been as impacted, perhaps. And so I think we'll have to assess it as we go, depending on the burden of the virus in local communities. But I think we need to be honest with our members and be prepared for that possibility.
Do you think that, just to kind of tag on to that a little bit, because that's a very scary thought, thinking I might have to, not I, but a high-risk patient might have to stay at home for upwards of 2 years. What role do you see some of the antibody testing maybe playing in this? And I not that I wanted to turn this into COVID, but it just kind of sparked a thought in my head that if I have a family member who has lung cancer and I have tested positive for the antibodies, does that make it safe for me to be around?
I think the jury's still out on that. And first of all, part of how we effectively reopen our society is, are we at a point where cases have been steadily declining for a period of 14 days? Do we have sufficient testing such that we can readily test people? Do we have sufficient contact tracing so that we can follow up on, the contacts you may have been in touch with should you become infected? And I would say until all those parts are effectively in place, we're not in a position to really kind of open the floodgates. In terms of antibody test, we have to proceed with caution. We cannot view that as Amy Moore now has a seal of approval and she's good to go, because we don't know, one, based on prior studies with SARS and MERS, it appears that immunity to coronaviruses may last for a period of several months. And we don't yet know what that looks like for SARS-CoV-2. Our assumptions are based on previous coronavirus outbreaks. And so the jury is still out. Again, this virus, we just became aware of it in December of 2019. We're just a few months into this. So we don't know what long-term immunity looks like. And even if you have antibodies on a test, how long are you protected? Can you be reinfected? The other issue is the quality of those tests. So, in our efforts to be flexible and rapidly deliver tests, they haven't all been properly validated. And so the risk is that a patient gets an antibody test and they have a positive result and they think, I'm good to go. I don't have to do this stay-at-home business anymore. The risk is if you have a faulty test, you may be given false assurances. And the other challenge is, of course, we know the role of asymptomatic transmission with this virus. So there are risks, and I think everything has to be evaluated closely, but I think we need to be thoughtful. Now, don't take it as Amy Moore said, if I have lung cancer, I need to stay at home for the next 2 years. But I think we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that restrictions may loosen, then we may have to clamp down again. And, if you have an underlying condition, be it, obesity or diabetes or cardiovascular disease, lung cancer, there's a whole number of conditions that put you at elevated risk. You need to take precautions. You haven't fought this long to be taken out by a virus. So do what you need to do to stay safe.
Yeah. And thanks for that, Amy. And it sounds to me like the short answer might be we just don't know enough yet. That might be the short answer, right? And Jennifer,
that is the short answer. We don't know, so better be safe than sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually want to echo that theme of we don't know enough yet. It goes back to, along with the antibody testing, some of the reason that we think it's so important to follow patients during this time with efforts like the registry, with other efforts. We don't know what having an active serious COVID-19 infection will do for patient outcomes in the long term, but we also don't know if there's any effect of people who were asymptomatic and maybe had an infection and didn't know it or had a very mild case. And so the science is going to continue to change and emerge over this time, and things like antibody tests that will tell us whether you had an infection, even if you had a bad or mild or completely asymptomatic case, are going to be really important pieces of data to follow on everyone as we go forward. So these kind of unknown questions, I think, just really underscore the reason that we need to think so seriously about new science and research questions during this time and continue to contribute to studies and invest in the research community.
I would just add quickly, Danielle, that I think we'll all be watching closely what occurs in places like Asia, where those restrictions have been lifted, and countries like Singapore, where they did an amazing job initially, and now they're seeing those flare-ups. And now, of course, with the reopening of many of our states in the Southeast, the clock has started. And, what will it look like 3 weeks from when, these businesses reopen? I think that's going to be very telling. And as Jennifer said, we're accumulating data each and every single day. And what we're advising people today may look completely different from what we're advising people in 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, a year. So even though I would urge caution right now, we may have more confidence in the coming weeks and months to say, you can, start to think about coming out. And we know more about the implications for patients with lung cancer. So this story is being written in real time, and that's the reality.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Andrew, I just wanted to touch back with you really quick. We talked about some impact on clinical trials and patient participation in those trials during the pandemic. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't anything else you wanted to add before we kind of move on from there.
No, just that I think, certainly while we're in this crisis right now, there's a lot of things we're thinking about how to adapt, clinical care and research, to protect patients and doctors and things now. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that a lot of these changes will have impact kind of, after we return to life as normal as it would be. Some of the things we're seeing now are really positive changes that we some of the adaptations to help people kind of do more from their home clinic as it would be. The things we talked about, like mobile phlebotomy, doing telemedicine visits, figuring out those things now because of the crisis is making doctors and health systems and patients more comfortable with it. And I think we'll see some of those changes last way beyond what we're, this particular crisis, and actually improve clinical care in the future. There's a lot of patients, in terms of taking the example of clinical trials, you may not necessarily be close to a particular university that's running a clinical trial that might be a good option for you, but getting in place some of these things where you can get more procedures done locally, and be able to talk with the trial doctors via telemedicine may help more people access clinical trials in the future and reduce the burden on people's lives. And that's a real positive. And also, some of the things that the others mentioned in terms of how research is changing, I think will last way beyond this too. The way that researchers are coming together to, collaborate in ways they've never have before. I used to be a bench researcher myself, and what I'm seeing now and hearing from others about how international researchers and kind of researchers that have been working on disparate fields are coming together to really tackle this crisis together. Those are lessons that really aren't going to be forgotten. We're going to come back and see improvements in the research infrastructure, and I think there's a lot of reason to hope is kind of one of the messages that I want to leave. That this situation, while having impact now, is going to improve in the future too.
I absolutely love that, Andrew, the silver lining sort of aspect to all of this. This is definitely there. I think it's easy to get bogged down in some of the scary stuff and the things that make us afraid, but there are definitely silver linings to be found. I don't know, Jennifer or Amy, if you want to add to any of the silver lining sort of aspect of this.
I agree with what Andrew said. I think there are going to be a lot of changes that revolve around flexibility and patient access and things to that. I think the other silver lining that Amy also alluded to earlier is the collaboration. This has been something that makes everybody sort of stop what they're doing and talk to all their colleagues on all the issues. We had good collaboration before, but I think it's even gone to a next level with the pandemic because everybody's in it together. And that's great for the research community, and I think will continue to help propel a lot of things forward and should really bring a note of hope to the entire community as well.
Yeah, and I would just like to kind of reinforce what it means when we talk about, the research community mobilizing. You have to understand, we first had the sequence of this virus on January 11th. We didn't know it existed until the end of December of 2019. So we go from declaration of a new virus, end of December, to having the viral sequence January 11th, to the administration of the first vaccine in humans 2 months later on March 16th. That speed is unprecedented. Today, there are about 115 vaccine efforts underway. 78 of those are confirmed, 37 are unconfirmed. Of those 78, about 73 are preclinical. They run the full spectrum of approaches and platforms, be it DNA vaccines, RNA vaccines, peptides, or inactivated, live attenuated. They're, all hands are on deck. And, there is a significant resource and manpower being deployed to do this. We talk about 18 months. I think that is best case scenario. The record for delivering a new vaccine is currently 4 years, but the technology has changed since that was achieved in the 1950s. So we have tools at our disposal that we didn't have, years ago, decades ago. So that's in our favor. We're also looking at repurposing existing drugs. We're looking at development of new therapeutics. And there's some encouraging data on, a drug called remdesivir. We saw mixed data, basically a failure of the hydroxychloroquine study that was done. So, we have to proceed with caution where appropriate. We have to let science, do its thing as carefully as possible to ensure patient protection. But the takeaway is there is a massive global effort to defeat this virus, and it is moving with breathtaking speed. And, I, being trained as a virologist and then being a cancer researcher and now, being in this space, I take great comfort in that, and I see what's happening. And I think that's very reassuring.
Thanks, Amy. That was a great way to sort of close out this conversation, starting with how science and research is adapting, what patients can still do, the positivity to be found in it, and then really closing up with the collaborative global efforts that are being put forth around this virus. I think, to your point, are truly inspiring. So thank you all for your contributions to this conversation today. I do, as always, need to close out with a little bit of housekeeping, and I want to start with a couple of things you heard about today, but some things that GoTo Foundation can do and wants to do to help you during this difficult time. And of course, there's our helpline, and I know that the number came up a little bit earlier. I'm sure Rocky will flash it again. It's 1-800-298-2436. There it is. Or of course, you can email us at support@gotofoundation.org. We are here to help you. We're to help you answer your questions. If there are questions we don't have the answers to, we will point you in the direction of resources to get you the answers that you need. We want you to know you are not alone during this. Also, for some of you who have been doing this for a while and think you might want to be a mentor to somebody who's maybe really new to this lung cancer space, and you want to consider becoming a phone buddy, that's a great opportunity to stay engaged and buddy up with somebody who really needs maybe some of that mentorship through all of this. Of course, all of our social media channels, our online support groups through Health Unlocked and Belong. We are here to serve you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Another thing I want to throw out is if you guys have any ideas around things you would like to see at the Lung Cancer Living Room. I think after last week, I got a couple of ideas from a few of you, but please email us at lungcancerlivingroom@gotofoundation.org and give us your ideas. If there are any questions you had today that did not get answered, or questions that you think about after this kind of settles in with you a little bit, please, again, don't hesitate to shoot us an email because we will get you the answers to those questions. So next week, April 28th, I want to let everybody know we've got Dr. Ramchandran from Stanford. She's a medical oncologist and a clinical associate professor down there, and she's going to come talk to us about supportive care, not only the importance of incorporating it into your care, but how to maybe still access some of that during these unprecedented times. So be sure to tune in for that. And then on May 5th, we've got Dr. David Gandera coming back to sit and talk with us, specifically around maybe some concerns we know our communities having around some of these delayed treatments, whether it's scans or biopsies, surgeries, those types of things, and to be able to answer your questions about that. So be sure to come back and see us over the next couple of weeks. Of course, for those of you out there watching who had events planned in your area, please, as I mentioned last week, go to our website, gotofoundation.org, to check on the status of events in your area and how they might be adapting as well during this time to become virtual events that you can participate in. Huge thank you again to all of our panelists and my colleagues who I couldn't be more honored and proud to work with every day. Amy, Andrew, and Jennifer, thank you so much for chiming in today. It was great to have you. Thank you to everyone watching out there on the live stream, either through Facebook or YouTube. Like I said, you are why we do this. So we're happy to be able to bring this to you on a weekly basis during this time. A huge thank you to our supporters, without whom we simply could not do this. Amgen, AstraZeneca, Boehringer Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, Genentech, Lilly, Merck, Novartis, Oncocyte, Takeda, and Foundation Medicine. A huge thank you to all of you. And with that, we are going to close out and say till next week to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see. So I will fight if you'll fight. Yeah, I will fight, but only if you'll fight. Oh, we can make it through this like sailors in a tempest. Like sailors in a tempest together. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.